Anybody here Lego fans? Just in general, okay? We got one hand, that's a big hand right there. He's like, let's go. How high can I touch the sky? That's what I'm talking about. We got some in the back row. I wasn't looking over here. We got Lego fans over here? Okay, great. We got a few. More over there. This is more Lego than you. So if we need something built in the last days, I'm going over this way. You know what I'm saying? Legos are a gift, right? I mean, Legos are the gift that keep on giving. I mean, you get the gift and you put it together, you follow the directions, and it's gorgeous. You know, and then your kid destroys it 5 minutes later because all of a sudden this race car, it doesn't need a race car. It needs to have a unicorn horn and a spoiler the size of Texas on the back of it, and we're going to smash these things together or see if you can fly off and so then it becomes the next gift, because for sure after they smashed it together, they cleaned up, but they didn't clean up. They cleaned up. And then tomorrow night when you're walking through the middle of the house in the middle of the night, it's that gift that gives to you again. It's like, hey, remember me? And it sticks it to us, you know what I'm saying? And then all of a sudden, we're blaming God. We're saying out loud what we think about God because God put the Lego there. You know what I'm saying? God is the one who invented Legos. Legos, I think, can teach us a lot of lessons. In fact, there are studies that show that Legos aid in a child's development. That if children who engage in playing Legos, these are just a few of the positive things that come from Legoing. I don't know if Legoing is a thing, but we're just going to go with it. Problem solving. Mathematics, spatial awareness, creativity, the permission to experiment, develops fine motor skills. This is probably the one that I'm most aware of: perseverance and frustration management. Patience. This next one is probably one of my favorites. As a parent, it's one of my favorite things, just period. Doesn't just happen in Legos, but it for sure shows up in Legos. Every time one of my kids put a Legos together, and usually it's E that's putting the Legos together, when he's done with the Legos, the very first thing he wants to do is show me. He's like, look what I did. Like, look what I have completed, you know? Like it started off in like 17 bags of different things and these little plastic pieces of paper that you fold up, and we're like, oh, we're going to hold on to these. And so we put them in a drawer somewhere, but eventually the wife gets tired of the drawer full of stuff, and so she throws it out. She says, we never use those things anyway. Well, in 4 years from now, I'm going to need the instructions to that Lego tractor. You know what I'm saying? I'm not going to have it because you threw it out, right? So, but that's what he's doing. He's like, hey, look at this. Look what I did. Some self-confidence comes from it. Focus and concentration. There is benefits to going through the process of learning how to build. And not just learning how to build, actually building. Like actually doing something, putting the pieces together and creating a finished product. A finished product that actually doesn't just sit on a shelf. I mean, they do have those kind of Legos. You know what I'm talking about? They got those big architecture Legos. They got like life-size replicas. When I say life-size, not life-size, like fits on this little stand right here. Like of the White House, you can get one of those. That's what I'm talking about. I've always wanted, like that looks pretty special. Or the Louvre. If you're a Louvre fan, I don't know if you're a Louvre fan, but they got those like big, huge things. They've got Hogwarts. You can have Hogwarts sitting in your bedroom, like the whole thing, like in Lego, like just immaculate, massive things, right? Building something. Making something worth looking at. When we think through the process of making something, Legos, it typically happens in the process of an afternoon. Like you get it, you open the box, you put it together. We are a lot like Legos, just the long form of Legos. We don't get put together in an afternoon, but the truth is, haven't we been put together and then smashed and we fall to pieces? And the truth is that when we fall into pieces, we probably have lost the original instructions, and so we try to put it back together, and it looks nothing like what it was originally intended to be, but you're just putting the pieces together because you're not going to give up on the Legos. You're going to use it for something else, right? And that's a lot of times the way we are. Say, okay, we are not what we were. But the truth is, when I look at kids playing with Legos, they could care less if it's what it was originally intended to be. Because the truth is, the pieces, every single one of them means something to them. And whether it looks just like it originally intended to before they smash it together, in their minds, it's exactly what they need it to be. We are a lot like Legos. I think the church helps with this. At least it should. Let me catch you up in just a couple of minutes if you've missed our last 2 weeks, because this week builds on the first two. We started looking at a guy by the name of Dr. Luke, who gives us this historical kind of vision, or not vision, but visual of what it was like in the early church from a historical perspective. And so he ties in what happens in the church, and he ties in what's happening in the Roman world at the same time to give us this very official perspective as someone who's an actual historian. And so Dr. Luke begins to chronicle for us the life of this thing that's referred to as the church, which up until just recently when he begins to write hadn't existed. The church branched out of Judaism, and it's because there was a guy named Jesus who died on a cross and then resurrected from the dead. And from that, this new movement from Judaism started called Christianity. And with that, Dr. Luke begins to record in the book of Acts all the things that are happening to the church. And we see, for some reason, he's very interested in letting us know that the church is growing numerically at an enormously rapid pace. He starts with like 11 people, and then before you know it, in just a few months, it's grown to over 5,000 people. And so this movement is just enormous. And what we discovered week one is that when you have more people, it equates to more problems. And this was the same for the church. Even the Jesus-following people, the more people they got, the more problems they had. And one of the largest problems they had to solve was a problem that existed with widows. There were two different groups of widows. One group of widows that grew up in the area, spoke the language, was in and around Jerusalem. That this was what they called home. And there was another group of widows that were foreigners. They were still Jewish, but they didn't grow up in Jerusalem. They grew up in some other country. They lost their husbands. Their children had passed away, or they didn't have children. And the laws in the first century was women couldn't own property, couldn't inherit property, couldn't make a purchase of anything, couldn't testify for themselves in court. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't even work most jobs. And so when that happened, they would migrate back to Jerusalem, where their people came from originally, sometimes generations and generations ago, because there was a group of Jews there and this new group of Christians that found a responsibility and said, you know what, we ought to take care of widows and orphans. And so they knew they would be provided for. And so we got the group that grew up here and the widows who are from somewhere else, who don't speak the language, who don't know the ins and outs of Jerusalem, and they were being neglected. Same circumstance. They couldn't provide for themselves. It was impossible in their culture. And because they didn't speak the language, because they weren't there, they didn't have the connections, they were being neglected. And so the leaders of the church got together and said, hey, here's the deal. We've grown. There's no excuse for us to neglect people. We can't do that. And so we don't have the ability, just a small group of us, to continue to meet every single need that arises. So we got to recruit some more people to jump in the game. So he said, find 7 people from among you who meet 2 qualifications, are full of the Holy Spirit, so fully devoted followers of Jesus, and are full of wisdom, known to be full of wisdom. And so they got 7 guys, and they told those 7 guys, hey, solve this problem. And they did. That was the way that we were introduced to a guy named Stephen. Now, Stephen, when we pick up his story, Stephen is well developed already. He's already known to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus. He is known in the community, in the church, as being someone who's full of wisdom, a problem solver. And so they recruit Stephen. We also get the opportunity to know a little bit more about Stephen. That Stephen not only is a really great teammate or team player in the church, Stephen also has this affection for sharing the truth about Jesus with people who don't know him. And so he's going synagogue to synagogue, small little tiny church around in Judaism, one after another, sharing Jesus resurrected, Jesus was crucified. And eventually he runs into a synagogue that doesn't like it. It's the synagogue of the freedmen. And they say, hey, we're going to put a stop to this. So they bring him to trial, and they get false witnesses that they buy and pay for. And sure enough, they come and lay lie about Stephen. And eventually Stephen realizes, hey, I can't do anything. Like these people are saying I say it, but he's stuck. And so he has a closing statement. And in his closing statement, where he's on trial for his life, because he's preaching something that the Jews didn't agree with, he says, look, let me tell you 2 things. If you forget everything else, let me just make 2 points to you. He says, number 1, you can't put the enormity of our God in something we've built with our own hands. You just can't do it. He's too big. In fact, he goes on to say that God is so big, All of the heavens are his throne, and the earth that we live on, the entire earth, is what he props his feet up on. That's how big God is. So to think that we're going to fit him in a tiny little temple, a little house of God, and keep him there is just ridiculous. The second point that he wanted to make was that throughout the Jewish people's history, God had sent prophet after prophet after prophet, after king, after anointed person, over and over again. And every single time they were rejected. And so he was like, guys, all of these people we rejected, we now respect. We admire them. But in the moment we rejected them, we had to learn the hard way. Let's not do that anymore. We killed Jesus. Let's not figure it out 4 and 5 generations from now and write about it. Let's get it right now. Well, they're not okay with it. So they scream and shout and they drag him outside of the city and they kill him. And at the close of that little story, we get one line that Dr. Luke gives us some really great insight into. There's a guy that's standing there watching the whole thing happen named Saul. And Saul oversees the murder of Stephen, which becomes the very first person to lose their life because of what they say and what they believe about Jesus. Now, the thing is that guy named Saul didn't just stop there. In fact, that was the catalyst that started an enormous persecution of the church. And so Saul started dragging people out of their houses. If he could find Christians, he was taking them to court with the precedent now that they believed like Stephen believed. That Stephen believed like Jesus believed. We crucified Jesus, we stoned Stephen, we're going to get the rest. And so he goes all throughout Jerusalem and people scatter everywhere. Not just in Jerusalem, they go to the cities next door and the city next to the city next door and the next city over. Eventually, Saul can't find anyone, and so he goes to the temple and says, hey, here's the deal. I need papers to go to the next city to let them know I am hunting down Christians. And sure enough, they give him the papers. And so he sets off for a neighboring city about 140 miles away, a 6-day walk called Damascus. And on the way to Damascus, he comes face to face with Jesus. There's this bright, enormously blinding light that literally puts him on his knees and he can't see for 3 days. And Jesus asks him a really simple question. Why are you persecuting me? And he introduces Saul to the idea that your why better be a really good why. I'm not getting on to you for doing what you're doing, though that's what I think he should have done. That's not what he did. He said, I just want to know why. And do you know why you're persecuting me? 3 days later, there's a follower of Jesus named Ananias who goes over to the house that Saul is hiding in, blind, and he prays for him, and Saul receives his sight, is baptized, and gives his life to Jesus. And he says, hey, I'll do whatever you ask me to do for the rest of my life. And that's where we pick up. Acts chapter 9, verse 20. At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. Now this is so different than what he had been preaching. Saul is a known commodity. He's someone that's widely known and celebrated in the Jewish community. And so when he shows up to teach, people show up to listen. And all of a sudden, he's not showing up to teach about the law of Judaism. He's not there to teach about a religion. He's not there to teach about the Jewish tradition or ceremony or ritual, which are all things that up until just a couple of days ago were the most important things in his world. Instead, he shows up and he begins to preach that Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph, the son of a carpenter, the kid from the podunk town not too far from here, that the Romans crucified, is the Son of God. That's an enormous change. Like everybody shows up to listen to Saul teach and like, yeah, he's about to give us some depth into this Jewish way of life. He's about to unlock some secrets, some hidden secrets that only someone so wise and so knowledgeable could know. But that's not what happens at all. Saul just starts telling them about Jesus, crucified and resurrected. What's crazy is all the things that he valued suddenly had no value to him. Let me read you some insight into what Saul writes about how he values Jesus as opposed to what he had valued previously, only a few days before. This is how Saul puts it. If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. What he's saying is, hey, if anybody thinks that they've got a resume, like a resume worth sharing, let me just that they are confident, that they are proud about, let me just give you a heads up. Mine is better, is what he's saying. I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day. That's a heck of a thing to put on your resume. Like a top line, on the 8th day, they circumcised that bad boy. You know what I'm saying? He's just saying, hey, I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. There were 12 tribes in Israel. Benjamin was a big deal. Of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In other words, there's Hebrews and then there's Hebrew. You know what I'm saying? Like there's Hebrews, but then there's Hebrew. And I was up here, okay? So in terms of all the Jewish people, I'm at the top. In regard to the law, I'm a Pharisee. In other words, the Pharisees were the experts in the law. There's no one that had greater knowledge of the enormous depth of the law of Moses than the Pharisees. In regards to the law, I'm a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. He said, if you want a point, if you want to know how determined I am to take care of my business, if you want to know how type A I am, if you want to know how just resilient I am, just look at my record at persecuting the church. I almost single-handedly destroyed the church. He says, as for righteousness based on the law, I'm faultless. But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. So everything he just listed, prior to the road to Damascus, he would have considered these are gains for me. This sets me above everyone. And he says, now what I considered a gain, I now consider a loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. And then he goes even further. He says, I consider them garbage. Garbage, that I may gain Christ. Now, this is important. This is important. He's not saying everything that he accomplished is garbage. He's saying if that's what I've got to give up to gain Jesus, it's just trash to me. It's just trash. Now, what we know about Saul is that he's going to leverage all of those things he had gained to do incredible things. Incredible things. But he's saying, look, it's all on the chopping block. It doesn't matter what I've accomplished in my life or what I have built in my life. It doesn't matter what I have put together, what I have with my own hands created. If it comes between me and pursuing what Jesus has asked me to do, all of those things, just take it out with the trash. I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining the resurrection from the dead. He's saying, hey, here's the deal. I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I had a plan with my life. I thought I knew exactly where I was headed. And then I realized that I actually don't know what I don't know. And one of the things I didn't know was Jesus. And now that I know Jesus, here's the bottom line truth. Jesus is enough. That there is nothing in your world you can build with your own hands that's worth holding on to more than Jesus. People couldn't believe the transformation that had happened. It says, at once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. All those who heard him were astonished and asked, isn't he the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on this name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priests? They just couldn't make sense out of it. They're like, hold on. And I don't know, Luke doesn't tell us what it was like when Saul entered the city of Damascus. Like, we don't know if there was a crowd that watched him blindly walk in being led by his friends because he couldn't see. All we know is that he wasn't quite at Damascus. He was almost there, and then he had to be led by, they had to hold his arms to allow him to walk. I don't know if it was a public spectacle. I don't know if they got there in the middle of the night. We don't know. But word spreads in small little biblical towns that, hey, their big guy from Jerusalem is here, the guy who's rounding up the Christians, because for sure we already do know what Luke tells us. The Christians knew he was there. And they were hiding. And so they're listening to this guy talk, and they're just like, I don't get it. And at first they're astonished, but their astonishment quickly turns into frustration. And their frustration then gives way to hatred. Because suddenly Saul is exactly like the other guys they had tried to get rid of. Except Saul has something the rest of them didn't. Saul had some credibility in the synagogues and the temple. He wasn't like a Stephen who was just a waiter of tables and all of a sudden started talking craziness about a crucified, resurrected Jesus. No, this was one of the superstars in the Jewish faith. And so they decide we've got to do with him like we did with the others. And so they try to kill him. They put Saul in hiding, and eventually they realize they can't even get him out of the gates of the city. And so they put him in a basket and lower him out the window, out the city wall, to get him out in the middle of the night. Well, he goes to Jerusalem, where in his mind, he's like, you know what? I got to get around these people that were the good friends of Jesus. The Bible would call them the apostles, right? Let me get with these apostles. That's what I need to be. I don't need to be here in Damascus. These people are crazy. I got to be in a basket in Damascus. I don't want that. Let me get to Jerusalem. And so he goes to Jerusalem, and this is what happens. When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were afraid of him, not believing that he was really a disciple. They're like, you are undercover and MI6ing us right now. You know what I'm saying? Like you are a Russian spy in the midst of what's happening here. Like, I don't know what's going on. We are 007. Who knows? But for sure, we do not trust a hill of beans of what you're saying, Saul. We don't believe it. And so we are not allowing you to have our little secret code to our secret hideout. That's not going to happen because you're going to arrest us all. All of a sudden, Saul was starting to realize a problem that we're incredibly familiar with, is that his failures had come with him. His shortcomings had made the journey to Jerusalem with him. It turns out he couldn't get disconnected from his bad decisions. And it turns out that he wanted to go to a new place where maybe he'd find a little of acceptance, but his failures were so loud. People were having trouble seeing him for the changed man that he was. Any of you ever experienced that? Where you made a decision, maybe you're involved in something unhealthy and your whole world knows it. Like all your friends know it. Maybe they've tried to talk to you about it, but you've gotten mad at them, and so they're like, okay, well, I'm not going to bring that up anymore. That ruined the weekend. So they're just going to avoid it, right? And then all of a sudden, though, you do, for some reason, you decide, I'm going to make a change. I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to stop this, right? And then all of a sudden, you show up, and they're like, they're not buying it. There's no way someone actually changes this quickly. There's no way this is legit because we've got such an enormous history with you. We know you too well to know that this new movement in your life, maybe it's legit for a minute, but the truth is you will be back to the old you before you know it. The truth is that our failures are our most committed followers, aren't they? They'll follow us anywhere. Man, man, it's like our shadow, and we try to Peter Pan that bad boy, but we can't. You know what I'm saying? Like we can't. It's like stuck to us, and our failures just follow us everywhere. And they're committed. Our failures are committed to following us. They're like, hey, friend, wait up. I'm coming with you. And I'm like, no, don't come with me. Like, no, I got to come with you. Are you worried your failures follow you? The truth is, most of us are, because most often we become fearful of our failures. I've been there many times. Our failures will follow us. There's no way around it. Which is why there has to be a mindset shift. And if failures feel a little more weighty than just simply a shadow, where you can feel failures not just that, hey, they're there like a shadow would be there, but they actually are pulling on you, like they've got a little grip on you, that they've got maybe they've attached a chain to you or a rope to you, or maybe they're pulling at your shirt and they're grabbing, maybe they've got a hold of your feet and you're like dragging them to wherever you're going and they are locked on tight and they're not gonna let go. If that's where you're at, the only way to make this work, the only way to actually, because you can't separate, you can't Peter Pan the thing, like they're coming with you no matter what happens. The only way to make this work is this: you've got to become a fan of your failure. You got to become a fan of your failure. You got to do what Saul did, right? In that moment, Saul says, hey, here's the deal. If you want to look at how determined I am, look at how big I failed at persecuting the church. He's not hiding it anymore. He's like, yeah, that was me, 100%. And I'm telling you, if God can just take that ridiculousness, if he will allow me to take that same desire and that same energy and that same determination, and he will allow me to leverage it towards something for him, there's no telling what God can do. He said, hey, I'm going to be a fan of my failure because I know God can leverage my failure for something incredible. Now, this doesn't mean that we prop up our failures and that is the thing that we lead with. By the way, did you know? I am guilty of X, Y, and Z. My name is Clint. Nice to meet you, right? That we're not exalting the failure. It's just that we're a fan of it. Because when we're a fan of it, here's the deal. Failing in that moment, when we become a fan of our failures, it's because we realize this is the truth. Failing leads to learning. Failing leads to learning. And so now, are we happy about the failures? No. Are we proud of them? No. But we're a fan of them because it's like, man, I have learned so much, and I'm so grateful that God has extended me another opportunity to do what he has called me to do in spite of the enormous opportunity to learn, which is now called a failure. That failures lead to learning. And the truth is, if we can figure that out, if we really do become fans of our failures, that allows our failing to lead to our learning. Learning leads to growing. Man, if you had asked anyone, is there anyone who needs to spiritually grow? Right? Like nobody in the Jewish world would have said, Saul probably could use a little spiritual growth. Like he's probably here, he needs to kind of go. Nobody would have had Saul on his list. But Saul grows exponentially more than he could ever dream, hope, or imagine on the backside of him beginning to learn from his failures. He becomes a spiritual giant that dwarfs who he was prior to his road to Damascus experience. In fact, it almost makes his spirituality prior to meeting Jesus look like it didn't even exist relative to what he becomes. Learning leads to growing, and ultimately, growing leads to fulfilling. And that's both ways. That your growth will fulfill you, that you will suddenly understand what satisfaction is, what being satisfied is, in a way you've never experienced. Because you are also not just fulfilled, you are fulfilling what God desires for you. And when you are in that rhythm, when you are in that type of stride, nothing can touch you. Things stop. Man, there's obstacles, there's speed bumps, people tackle you, so people touch you for sure. But the truth is, it's just we're going to keep going because the satisfaction of being inside the desires of God allows you to see the obstacles and the issues with a different kind of clarity. Growing leads to fulfilling. But I'll be honest with you, while failure ultimately leads to fulfilling if we become a fan of our failures, we learn from our failures, and then we grow from what we have learned, ultimately that failure and that fulfilling does create issues. Like it's not when we have achieved, it's not like when we've arrived, when suddenly we've gotten to the place that we want to go, that okay, now everything's going to calm down. Like picture like lazy Sunday afternoons in a recliner. Maybe if you're a football fan, it's watching some football where the Falcons actually win a game. Like that's a good Sunday. You know what I'm saying? Like, wow, this is nice. I don't even remember what that's like, but it's nice, right? The call to follow Jesus with every part of our life is not like a good Sunday afternoon. In fact, it oftentimes invites interruptions that are enormously inconvenient. When we take a look at what God was able to do through Saul, we only have to skip a couple of chapters further through all of this mess, and we find that Saul is also known as Paul. Not just any Paul, like the church planter Paul. The Bible refers to him as the Apostle Paul. And this Saul started unlike any, if you were to look at what Paul, the church planter, accomplishes, and all you had was that, no one would ever guess that that was his beginning. That's the way that God made him into the person he would become. At the end of the day, what we find is that Paul ends up writing 13 books that we find in the Bible. Almost right at half of the entire New Testament, right? The Bible's got two sections, an Old Testament, which chronicles the making of the people of God, and the New Testament, which chronicles from Jesus forward to the birth of the church and the first couple of generations after it. So in that New Testament, he writes almost half of what we have and what we know to be true about churches that spread over Asia and Europe and the issues that first century Christians were going through. 13 books. In addition to that, we know for a fact that Paul planted 14 different churches. That he traveled to a city and he would gather some believers and he would teach them for a time and then he would move on to another city. In fact, most scholars think that that number is a little low, that it's closer to 20 to 25 churches that Paul planted. But we know of 14 for sure. The truth is, though, is those churches that he planted, they weren't just churches. They were church planting churches because the church planter planted them. And so Paul shows up and he plants a church, but there's something inside of them that says, you know what? This isn't something we simply keep to ourselves. In fact, compared to what we've accomplished for ourselves, if it comes between us and Jesus, we might even consider this just throw it in the trash kind of garbage. And so it's so valuable to us, we're going to send other people out. And so the 14 churches that Paul planted other churches, every single one of them. Planted other little churches here and there, and those churches planted other churches. You know, we think that this story is about Stephen in the making, but it's not. Stephen was already made when we picked up the story. He was already well known to be full of wisdom, someone who can solve problems, and full of the Holy Spirit, a completely, fully devoted follower of Jesus. And we spent a whole week talking about Stephen doing these things. But the truth is that the last line of week 1 was there was this guy named Saul. And for the last 2 weeks, we've talked about Saul being developed and where he comes from and how he gets to where he is. And so, man, it's like, man, okay, we're looking at the making of Saul. But the truth is, the way the church works is that one making of someone else is the beginning of the next. And so, yeah, Stephen started it, and then Saul continued it. But the truth is, the 14 churches that Saul ended up planting, that Paul ended up planting, planted other churches. And before you know it, it crossed the pond. And before you know it, it was here in Georgia. And before you know it, it grew up into this enormous thing that now is you and I. That we are a result of the first 14 he planted 1,900 years ago. This moment of in the making for Saul is really the beginning of our making. It's the beginning of our story.